Hello and welcome to the Business Standard Morning Show. I'm Vinu Sandhu. Let's take a look at the stories for the day. Across India, the young generation has become intimately familiar with names such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, Cardano, and Solana. Meanwhile, the use of non-fungible tokens or NFTs has also picked up at a large scale. While regulatory uncertainty continues to surround cryptocurrencies in particular, the tax department might be getting ready to tap into the new area. With that in mind, here's what the crypto and NFT investors need to be aware of on the taxation front.
The government is again examining a proposal to tax the blockchain ecosystem, which includes cryptocurrencies and NFTs. In fact, the tax department wants the framework for taxing the use of blockchain for commercial purposes to be implemented even before legislation on cryptocurrencies is brought in. As it finalizes legislation that is to be introduced in the upcoming winter session of Parliament, the government is reportedly considering a middle path on cryptocurrencies. A government official who did not wish to be named told Business Standard that even when they are not regulated, the use of virtual currencies and NFTs is prevalent, and this is leading to a loss of revenue for the government. However, the official clarified that taxing such assets would not mean that trading in them would be legitimized. Instead, it would only be a step to tax such transactions which are currently slipping past the tax net. A similar plan to tax cryptocurrencies was considered in 2018. The official said that the framework for taxing blockchain would stay even if the government decides to ban assets such as cryptocurrencies, because blockchain can be used in many areas. With that in mind, a framework for taxing the use of blockchain in other areas and sectors is likely to be drawn up. So, what exactly are the details of the proposal under consideration?
With wider adoption of NFTs and cryptocurrencies, the tax authorities have moved a proposal to impose goods and services tax on virtual currencies as well as NFTs. The proposal is being examined by the Finance Ministry as the tax authorities believe that these transactions, the transactions on virtual currencies and NFTs, are outside the tax net and should be brought under the tax net to plug revenue loss or leakages. So the tax authorities are now considering to impose GST on virtual currency trade as well as NFTs. And the proposal is to consider transfer, storage, supply, exchange, management, trade, and even creation of cryptocurrencies as services under the goods and services tax regime. So now, if you trade in cryptocurrencies through an exchange, the exchange will have to pay GST to the government, and the exchange might pass on that tax liability on customers, and you and I, if we trade in cryptocurrencies, will have to pay that GST, which could be about 18%, since services are classified, services under the GST regime are currently taxed at 18%. And a similar proposal was considered in 2018 as well, when cryptocurrency trade had started flourishing. And now the tax authorities believe that, again, since cryptocurrency trade has started picking up, the investments are about 6 trillion rupees, and as well as NFT is being endorsed by so many celebrities. Now is the time to impose this tax and bring these transactions under the tax net.
According to the proposal, the exchanges may have to pay GST, and they may pass on the implication of the tax to customers. This would mean individuals having to pay GST on the transaction value of the trade executed. Some Indian crypto exchanges already pay GST on the trading fees they collect from users for facilitating trades. According to broker discovery and comparison platform BrokerChooser, India has the highest number of crypto owners in the world at 10.07 crore, and India's cryptocurrency market reportedly grew 641% over the past year. The push also comes against the backdrop of the endorsement of NFTs by Bollywood actors such as Amitabh Bachchan and Salman Khan.
Where did you first spot your now favorite honey brand or the A2 key that is adorning your kitchen shelf? There's a high chance that you stumbled on them while surfing Facebook or Instagram. Over 600 such brands in India, entirely born on the internet, are selling to customers directly. It is now called the direct-to-consumer or D2C rush. Let us understand how this trend is taking hold of Indian e-commerce.
With customers increasingly becoming more conscious about their preferences, they are demanding the same from their brands too. Gone are the days when you had to settle for a face wash or body scrub from one of the few available brands. Today, we have M Caffeine, a personal care direct-to-consumer or D2C brand that makes caffeine-based products, which it claims are vegan and hence more natural than the existing products in the market. Similarly, men's grooming has evolved as a niche market in itself. So we have Bombay Shaving Company, offering solutions to men's grooming needs such as shaving foams and razors, hair styling wax, and even charcoal facial kits. There are other brands like Ustra and Beardo in the same segment which are also making a deep cut. So let us look at the difference between the D2C and traditional retailers. A traditional retailer would manufacture the product, sell it to a wholesaler, who would then have to rope in a distributor, and finally get their products at a retail store from where the consumer would buy it. But D2C brands cut out the middleman. They manufacture their products, advertise them on the internet, and deliver them to consumers directly. By skipping the traditional fast-moving consumer goods or FMCG sales route, D2C companies say they are able to offer better prices to customers while earning higher margins at the same time. It is also about striking the right connection. D2C brands use social media to maintain a lasting connection with the consumers. There is a direct feedback loop, from where they pick up on conversations happening online and also use social media influencers to create content for Instagram to sell their products. For instance, Bewakoof, which today is a full-stack fashion e-commerce platform, started in 2012 as a brand selling quirky mobile covers and other accessories. The brand has a feature called Vote for a Design, where some of the company's designs are put out for vote by customers. Only the designs with a certain number of votes go into production. The rest are shelved. Let's go to Bombay Shaving Company's COO Deepak Gupta to understand more about the things that a D2C brand does differently.
Compared to large brands, we don't work with any agencies. We do all the stuff in-house. Our brand team, performance marketing team, and design team sit side by side and take decisions on the campaigns, the feedback from the campaign, and the agility required to make changes to the campaign is done all in-house at the same point of time. So this is very important for the success of a D2C business, which is difficult to do in a large corporate setup trying to build a D2C business. The design team is not measured only on the aesthetics of the creative, but also on the CTRs their creative get. For them, this become an important KPI to deliver to the business. The kind of team you hire for the business. We believe that D2C is not a FMCG business. It's a data science backed by consumer insight. So hiring of the right talent is important. We hire raw talent and then make sure that they go through the entire consumer journey and over a period of time become brand experts. So that's how we build the team. This is the edge we have over the large brands.
Earlier last month, fresh meat and seafood brand Licious announced that it had become India's first D2C unicorn. India has about 600 D2C brands at present. The sector was valued at over $1 billion at the end of FY21. And according to an Avendus Capital report last year, it is expected to grow to $100 billion by 2025. We spoke to Shivani Podar, co-founder and CEO of fashion brands Fab Valley and India, about how better data analytics ensures a nimble supply chain for D2C companies.
What D2C really means is that we sell a large part of our merchandise direct to consumer. And that really helps us get the right data in terms of what the customers are looking for, in terms of what do they like, not like, what price points are working, to really the last minutest degree of information. And that really helps our supply chain, because in terms of supply chain, which is very fast in fashion, where you really need data and analytics to understand the movement of different products and why they're moving or not moving, we are able to track that till almost like 90% accuracy in terms of knowing what attributes are working for us. And that's what makes our supply chain much more nimble, agile, and flexible, as opposed to the larger companies, where typical lead times for fashion range from 6 months to 12 months. But for us, for example, it will be less than 45 days. And that's how we've built our entire supply chain. And that's what D2C really does for a fashion house. It makes it so fast.
It's never been easier to start a D2C company. One can set up an online store quickly by using e-commerce software from Shopify, Magento, BigCommerce, Volution, Wix, etc. There are payment gateway solutions from Razorpay, Paytm, PayU, and PayPal, among others. Similarly, companies like ShipRocket, Delivery, and Ecom Express offer logistics solution to these companies. Clearly, the D2C wave can spawn several more brands in niche categories.
The ongoing bull run has tempted many companies to advance their fundraising plans by coming up with IPOs. However, nearly half of the 87 companies that were listed this year are trading below their respective issue prices. Our next report delves into the pointers that investors must keep in mind before applying for an IPO.
The IPO market is crammed with companies looking to raise funds. After Zomato, Paytm and Nykaa, bigwigs like Delhivery, MobiKwik, Adani Wilmar, Keventer Agro, LIC, Farmeasy and Go Airlines are set to hit the market over the next 6 months. While 87 companies have already mopped up over 72,000 crore rupees so far in calendar year 2021, which is a record in itself, the tally is expected to hit 1 trillion rupees by the end of this year. This is in contrast to just around 18,500 crore rupees raised in the corresponding 10 months last year. However, all is not well in the primary market. An analysis by Care Ratings shows that around 40% issues are trading below their prices, while only 23% are trading 100% above their issue prices. Overall, around half have given returns of above 10% so far. Dig a bit deeper and you will see that failure rate or proportion of issues that are quoting lower than the issue price is the highest among the issues with offer sizes either more than 1,000 crore or less than 10 crore rupees. At the 1,000 crore rupees plus level, 40% issues are quoting at a discount, while 61% issues are trading lower than their issue price in the lowest range category. The 500 to 1,000 rupees category has the lowest failure rate of just 1 in 13. It is 27% for the 100 to 500 rupees group and 40% for the 10 to 100 rupees category. So how can investors steer clear of weak public offers and pick the best ones? Sameer Kaul, who is Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Trust Plutus Wealth, answers these questions for you.
From an HNI perspective, we believe the following three things every investor should keep in mind. Firstly, what is the nature of the business that's going IPO? What are the unique moats? What are the unit economics and the long-term potential of the business? Secondly, what is the quality of management? What is their experience in the specific line of business? That's very important. And last but not the least, we must look at valuations, because essentially the early stage investors are selling out. At least some of them are selling out during the IPO. And when a new investor buys during the IPO, they have to basically look at the valuation at that point in time in terms of how much potential return they can get at the current valuation. So that's also a very important determinant in terms of making a decision whether to subscribe or not to the IPO.
For retail investors, Juzair Gabajiwala, Director of Ventura Securities, suggests these tips for investment in an IPO.
First of all, do not apply for more than the minimum application amount. By applying for more, it is the probability of getting a higher allotment is just not there. This is the first mistake which is made by most of the investor. Second, look at the gray market premium. However, Look at this only for the purpose of getting an indicator about the level of interest by the market participants. So higher the premium, the better the issue is. But this is not to be taken as the listing price. Thirdly, do look at the promoter's background. This may be difficult to assess, but it is not impossible. One can look at the brands of the promoters and look at even the reports which you get to hear on various publications to get a fair idea. Lastly, is the issue a fresh issue of shares for expansion, or is it an offer for sale? What is popularly known as OFS. OFS by an investor who's a participant is okay, but if there's a OFS by a promoter, then you have to dig deeper. And do read at all the reports which various brokerages do come out with, and they have a subscribe or an avoid to the issue. You will get a better idea.
That said, while these factors can help judge traditional businesses very well, they may not be entirely suitable for new age businesses. For instance, Zomato's pricing was widely cited as very expensive and how it might not sustain. Similarly, Paytm's valuations are under scanner and so were Nykaa's. Then how should one judge public offers of these tech-based companies before investing? Is valuation really a concern for them?
Evaluation of these new age companies, the traditional models obviously don't work because many of these companies are either not profitable or they're barely profitable. So we have to look at these companies slightly differently. I think the one big advantage that these companies have, or many of them have, is access to a large set of client data. And that data actually is what is driving the valuation, because given the large set of potential customers or active users, there is a case for sustained growth in the valuation basis the cross-sell opportunity. So the starting point is, how many customers you have, how many customers you want to acquire, and definitely if you are a leader in the space, then you get that premium because it is then seen that you will be able to drive favorable unit economics given that you are a leader in the space. So the cross-sell opportunity based on how many customers you have and then the unit economics comes as key metrics that are used in terms of driving the valuation. Like we had said earlier, we have to look at how big the opportunity is. Financial services, which is the go-to industry for many of these companies, is definitely a vast opportunity in India given the low penetration. And then specifically for each company, we have to look at what is their specific moat, what are the sustained competitive advantages, and then what could be impact on spreads and margins as we go ahead and the company becomes larger.
In a nutshell, while a bull run will give investors ample investment opportunities to earn money, long-term gains from an IPO will be generated based on the individual company's growth outlook, target market, management quality, and financial stability. Now coming to Wednesday's session, markets may continue to consolidate in today's session amid lack of fresh triggers. September quarter earnings will drive the secondary market action, while initial public offers of Paytm, Sapphire Foods and Latent View Analytics will also be on investor radar. Shares of Nykaa will debut on the bourses today. The counter is commanding a strong grey market premium, suggesting a solid listing pop. Globally, market participants will eye October inflation data of China and the US, slated to be released later in the day.
Tax planning forms an indispensable part of our financial plans. And to save on taxes, we need to invest our money in instruments eligible for deduction under Section 80C. Out of these investments, ELSS tends to be one of the most popular and efficient tax-saving instruments. Here's all that you need to know about ELSS funds.
An equity-linked savings scheme or an ELSS is a type of equity diversified fund which invests a majority of its asset in equity shares of companies. So the next obvious question is, how does an ELSS fund work? Well, the fund manager maintains a well-diversified portfolio by allocating resources across sectors, market capitalization, and industries. The net asset value or the intrinsic value of one unit of fund fluctuates with ups and downs of underlying benchmark and overall economic factors. The investment mechanism of ELSS is such that the fund return tends to get affected by overall movement in the equity market. The objective is to keep the portfolio returns in line with expectations and not to let it be affected by extreme price movements in one of the industry segments. However, the fund attempts to generate enough returns which results in capital appreciation and tax benefits over the long term. Now let's talk about the key features. Unlike other funds, ELSS comes with a lock-in period of 3 years from the date of investment. It means that if you initiate a systematic investment plan or an SIP in an ELSS fund today, it will not be available for redemption before 3 years from now. You may exit, redeem or reinvest your units of ELSS funds only after the expiry of the 3-year period. Just like any other equity fund, ELSS funds are available in both dividend and growth options. From a tax standpoint, up to 1 lakh rupees of long-term capital gains from an ELSS scheme is tax-free. LTCG of over and above rupees 1 lakh is taxable at the rate of 10%. Under Section 80C of the Income Tax Act, your investment up to rupees 1.5 lakh can be claimed as a deduction from the gross total income in a financial year. Now let's talk about the risk factors. An ELSS predominantly invests in equities in addition to other asset classes. These are suitable for investors with a relatively high risk-taking capacity. However, when compared with small cap and mid cap funds, ELSS funds are safer because the volatility is much lower vis-a-vis the former. As these funds carry higher risk than debt funds, their return generating potential is also higher than the pure debt funds and balance fund. Now here's how you can choose a top performing ELSS. Shortlist funds which have a relatively long fund history of say 5 years. Ensure that the fund's returns are the result of the fund manager's expertise. You may choose fund performance which matches your investment horizon. Ensure that the fund's philosophy is in line with your financial goals. Scrutinize the fund's expense ratio and check whether it justifies the fund's alpha. However, at the end of the day, you need to remember that the fund returns are not guaranteed. ELSS funds are a smart way to save a lot on your tax outflow. But you need to bear in mind that the returns are not guaranteed. Consult your financial advisor before investing.
And that's all we have for you today. We will be back tomorrow morning with more news and analysis. Stay tuned and thank you for watching.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.